So for my thematic journal, I'm doing a video once again. This one is about the family and education readings. The readings that encompass family and education was the Ivy Chapter 10 Class Act reading, the motherhood article about African American mothers and Black culture, the homegrown article about how families do gender, the body of evidence, which was the one about girls' self-esteem and the development of adolescent girls, the Reynolds Deconstructing Young Boys' Masculinity article, and the Ferguson Naughty article about young African American males. So the first one that I will start with is the Class Act article. Essentially, this article was about, it started off talking about how stereotypes, gender stereotypes are reinforced or even created through fairy tales, methods of communicating gender biases and stereotypes to children, and how problematic traditional fairy tales were. Basically, normally fairy tales are, they view men as strong and masculine, and usually the girls need saving. For instance, Snow White, Cinderella, all of the Disney fairy tales, it's about how they need saving, and how problematic it is not only for young girls but for young men as well, because it's creating an unrealistic expectation for how children should act. The article then moves on and starts to talk about gender bias in children's books and literature in general. And then eventually it goes to, it's a progressive text that goes from childhood to the college age. It talks about the problematic relationships and academic achievement, the gender relations between men and women in the college classroom. It talks about the power complex and sexual harassment that typically, I don't want to say all cases are like this, but typically the power complex of sexual harassment of men over women, or how it relates back to how these mindsets were created, especially back in elementary school, when these stereotypes were first and these actions and these behaviors were first created. So I really liked this article. It was interesting in learning. I had no idea that schools who didn't take sexual harassment seriously lost federal funding, but that was something that was pretty interesting to find out about. The article goes on and talks about just harassment during different power complexes, harassment when there is no power complex, peer-to-peer harassment, and things of that nature. So that was basically what the Ivy Chapter 10 article was about. The next one, which was my favorite one that I've read because it really related close to home, was the, was the meaning of motherhood in Black culture and Black mother-daughter relationships. Essentially, this article was just about how Black mothers tend to put this pressure on their daughters, and basically how African American women and mothers don't have the opportunity to I guess break the cycle, and I guess let me rephrase. essentially, there has been this stereotypical view of Black women, due to the patriarchal past that our society has had. So essentially, motherhood that was done right was carried out by white women, who were able to stay at home with their children, were super feminine. And then this alternative, I guess, view of women was, well, I guess for Black women, was quote unquote the mammy, I think was what it was called. How there was a weaker and docile woman who cared for white women's children, a Black woman, she cared for white women's children. And then when she came home, she was a different person. So basically, this article was about why Black mothers teach their daughters the things that they do, why these gender, and it is a gender, it's reinforced gender, the way that they should behave, how they should raise their children, how that we shouldn't focus on marriage and should be more focused on getting an education and, more importantly, being independent. And that is really central to American culture more than anything. So this was my favorite article just because a lot of the things that I read were really relevant to my own life and my own experiences. So yeah, the next article that I'll be talking about is the Homegrown article by Nancy Lopez. Essentially, this article focuses on the raising of men and women, well, boys and girls, specifically immigrant or transnational families, how young girls are from the beginning of their upbringing are groomed to focus on learning how to keep a household up, and their mothers teach these young girls how to be feminine and how to take care of a household, and then eventually sometimes they even become a second mother. With this upbringing, it brings closer familial ties for women, and then on the other hand, boys are brought up with kind of less of centered around the family unit. The whole boys will be boys thing was really prominent in this article, and how the boys were more geared around spending less time out of the home and playing sports, hanging out with friends. With girls, with this upbringing, they were more focused on getting an education, and thought that their central upbringing was the reason why they were more focused on getting an education, as opposed to boys. So it was a pretty interesting article, but that's what I pretty much got from that. The next article that I'll be talking about is the body of evidence. Basically, it talks about how culture and media even contribute to the diluted viewpoints that girls have. Girls aren't allowed, I don't want to say aren't allowed, girls are basically brought up and are faced with all of these different, I don't want to say role models, but basically they are role models. The world surrounds young girls with figures that are a direct representation of what they should look like and what they should be. And so this article talks about how girls have to behave a certain way, have to think a certain way, have to have a certain body type, have to have a certain shape, and how damaging it is to young girls. It talks about how dieting is so problematic for young women and the weight issues that society puts on these young girls, and the obsessions that they have with their bodies. At the end of the article, it offers solutions or alternatives to the culture that we've created for young girls. And so I really thought that this was different from all of the articles that we read, because while many of the articles really described the problems, this one kind of offered a solution for the culture that we've developed as a country. The next article that I will be talking about is the primary studs article. This article essentially was about the over-sexualization of boys, how I guess being a boy directly contradicts masculinity and heterosexuality, and why this is problematic, and how this contributes to that overly masculine culture, and talks about how girls, when they're younger, they're immediately, being a young girl it's a direct attribute of femininity, as opposed to young boys. That's not the case. It talks about pressure from other young boys, from the culture, the hypermasculinity, that to where like young boys feel like they have to be hypermasculine in order to not be homosexual. It talks about how those younger upbringings directly affects them in adulthood, how they treat girls, their view and outlook on dating and relationships. One thing that really stuck out to me in this article was when it talked about the cycle of 6-year-olds, I think it was, of having multiple girlfriends at once, dating and dumping in that. And then there was the story of I think it was Pete and Todd, how those hyper heterosexual masculinities determined and ultimately defined his relationships with women. The last article I really liked as well, and I don't know if it's just because it's really interesting learning more about why the system is the way it is, and how systemic racism basically contributes to the disenfranchisement of African Americans. But the Naughty by Nature article was basically about how young African American men are basically not allowed to be young boys. The excuse for white males when they were younger usually is boys will be boys. But basically in the American school system, African American males at exceedingly higher rates are viewed as vicious and corrupt and problematic. The characteristics of masculinity that usually define young white males aren't given the same type of outlook as young black